This is Canon Fodder, episode 32. We are live from the Mexico-New Mexico border in the southwest United States, and with me this week is J.L. Hemingway. How we doing, J.L.?
Who am I? Why am I here?
So, I'm actually very glad to have you on. You are our first paid subscriber on our Substack, so I wanted to reach out and give you a platform to talk about one of your favorite books. This week being "The Crossing" by Cormac McCarthy. And I'm curious why this book? Why the second of a trilogy?
Well, thank you, TR. And I should plug right here that those first two questions that I asked were a quote from Admiral James Stockdale. I'm not sure if you remember Admiral Stockdale, but he was the vice presidential candidate to Ross Perot in a 1992 VP debate. He opened up with those two questions. It was quite hilarious. I think that's probably a little bit before your time, but
yes, just barely a hair's length before my time. But I know of the Perot campaign, and
yeah, I do feel strangely like Admiral Stockdale, for a moment, because I'm not a aficionado like yourself. I'm just a retired educator and now flower farmer, and I somehow or another got into this realm of literature. Found you guys on Twitter, the Double Dealer, and have followed previous guests of yours like Christopher Sandbach and Paul Fahrenheit, and I really like a lot of what those guys have to say and what they've written, and it's kind of inspired me. And through all of that, of course, with Cormac McCarthy's passing a year ago, it was kind of a rekindling of McCarthy nostalgia, if you will. And embarrassingly enough, to say, I was unaware of McCarthy up until a year ago, and given my background as primarily being a sports guy, I haven't followed literature all that closely. But when I think it was probably a Double Dealer podcast, or maybe something tangential, where Blood Meridian was reviewed, and I read Blood Meridian twice last year, and from that I just got really hooked into his style and kind of his aesthetic of writing and the time period and such. So I'm already being long-winded, and forgive me, but to answer your question, why The Crossing, it's because I found out that he wrote this border trilogy, and I read All the Pretty Horses first, and then I read The Crossing, and then a couple of months ago you reached out to me and said, hey, come on the Double Dealer, what book would you like to read? And I said, or review, and I said The Crossing. So that's the answer.
So as you mentioned, this is the sequel to All the Pretty Horses. Cities on the Plain kind of rounds out this trilogy. And if I had to summarize what the Border trilogy is about, it's about loss and it's about change. A lot of these, I'd say all three of the novels deal with, and we won't go too deep into all three. We'll try and stay on topic with The Crossing, but they deal with the passing of time, whether it's, and that seems kind of obvious on its face, but if I can get into it a little bit more, it's how the southwestern United States, whether it was Mexico before and then America, or whether it's, as we kind of see coming, it's going to be sort of Mexico again, if that makes sense, and how it affects those living on that border. Do you see that, or how would you describe it?
Now, I think you're on to something there, and I think that the word border is really interesting.
Mm.
and given, our landscape politically, in this country with, what defines an American, immigration, illegal immigration, legal immigration, and also just the fluidity of a lot of other categories that we are dealing with in our current culture. This idea of a border is really I think fascinating for me, reading these books, and philosophically, what does it mean to be on one side of the border? What does it mean when you as it is in this book, when you cross over the border into a foreign or an alien land? What does that mean? And so, to also your point about change, I find it really interesting that, and I should note here that I've only just began Cities on the Plain. I've not finished that book yet. So, but with all the pretty horses and the crossing, you're dealing with very young men, if not just adolescents, outright. I think Billy in this book was, just merely maybe 15 or 16 years old. And there's also really interesting dynamics with these young men and their fathers, and as it was in The Crossing, where Billy goes into Mexico and essentially leaves his father, leaves his family, and he's off alone. And in our age, it's hard to imagine a 16-year-old riding off into the horse into a foreign country to do anything, but yet, in that day and time, it was maybe not common, but it wasn't uncommon.
Yes, we're definitely dealing with a fluid sort of border, and the whole trilogy really does delve into that, where anybody can kind of cross here and there, and it's not commented on, but rather a simple inconvenience that almost doesn't exist, if that makes sense. So you've got Billy and his family. They live on a ranch right on the border with Mexico, and they sojourn, which is a word that he uses a few times, into Mexico, and plenty of people coming up north from Mexico, and it's treated almost like it's its own separate sort of region, right? So there's no need for a hard and fast border, a wall, whatever you want to say, which kind of goes into, I'd say, another aspect of McCarthy's work, right? That the borders that we create are completely man-made, and paid for through human struggle and strife, and not in this kind of this leftist hippie way. It's like, there's only one nation, man, or one race, and we're all kind of there, man.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing like that. More that he accepts that these things are always changing, whether they're changing hands, changing masters, changing demographics, but the land is sort of always there. You see that with Blood Meridian. You see that especially with No Country for Old Men, and in a lot of ways you see that with The Road as well.
That is a really good point, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because as it is in our time, borders are very distinct. You've got your piece of property. For me, I bought a house about a year ago, and one of the very first things that I did was I found the property line, and I put a fence up. So I knew, and the neighbors knew, and we all and there wasn't any hard feelings about putting the fence up. It's like, okay, this is mine, and that is yours, and we all kind of feel comfortable with that. But what you're describing, is that it is kind of porous, but the thing that I would like to add is that it's also real too. Just because something isn't rigid. What is described in the book is that when when Billy and eventually his brother go into Mexico, it is definitely a different land. They are certainly aliens, and culture does exist. As much as some on the other side of the room might like to deny, what makes up this element of culture, and what certain people value, and what others deem as virtue. It is different. It's certainly different in Mexico, and as it is different on the I'm not, if it would be the United States side at that point. So yeah, it is porous, but it's certainly two different worlds.
Oh, definitely. And I like that you make that distinction of, let's say a hard border of nations where there is also the cultural borders of peoples, right? Uh, I remember, I think I saw a meme, even a year or two ago, of different wolf packs having their territory and they don't overlap whatsoever. And this is, miles and miles of territory that these wolves understand to be either theirs or not theirs, which of course brings us, I think, a good segue to one of probably the most impactful part of the book, which is that first maybe half or third of the book, where Billy is bringing this mother wolf back to the mountains of Mexico instead of just killing it. So what's going on there?
I was hoping you would tell me.
No. Oh, the honor's all yours, my friend.
I would like to jump back to the very beginning.
Sure.
Actually, I think that there's something really interesting when Billy and his brother encounter the Indian. Outside of, I don't know if there's just outside of kind of their settlement or their buildings, and it's as if this Indian just kind of pops up. And the thing that struck me about that dialogue, which is hilarious because I know exactly the type of person this I've encountered this person where the Indian is only asking questions, but he's asking it in such a way that he's telling Billy what to do. He's asking about food, and he's asking about how many other people are in there, and so forth. And of course, foreshadowing, up until or up after Billy returns from Mexico. And of course, his family is, all killed, and the horses are stolen, and it's only his brother that survived. And it's not made explicitly clear in the book, but I kind of piece it together that, it was this Indian that was, he was kind of scouting things out. He was getting the lay of the land, and Billy, being naive, he doesn't bring this to his father's attention, which I think is a very grave error. That you have this alien person, kind of sniffing around, asking for food, and you give him food, and so forth. That's kind of a signal of danger in my eyes, in my understanding.
Right, and it's this very brief encounter that he has, but it does. How to put this? McCarthy, when he writes about Indians, whether it's in Blood Meridian, whether it's in the Borders trilogy, or he even has like this kind of. It's not exactly clear, but there are a couple characters in the road that I think are sort of Indian stand-ins. They're usually either, how to put this delicately, they definitely signify danger, right? But there's also this mystical quality to them. How many westerns have you watched, as a younger person?
Yeah, I've watched my fair amount. Lone Ranger and Tonto, yeah, obviously come to mind, and a handful of other classics as well.
So when you watch like especially the older John Wayne westerns, right? There's a quality that they're sort of this horde of this unthinking swarm, almost a force of nature unto themselves, right? Blood Meridian plays with this a little bit, while also kind of flipping it on its head because the Glanton Gang is itself this sort of force of nature sent to destroy them, right? And in The Crossing, this brief, you could say that the Indian is kind of scouting out, let's say, even though the times of the Indian raids and the scalping of white settlers on the frontiers is over at this point. There is this kind of foreboding. You're right.
Yeah, for sure. And this is not. I'm not putting any moral or value judgments here. We're just kind of thrown in the middle of this. In the middle of this story, and yeah, certainly this. Who knows what the story of this Indian is? I mean, Billy's family might have just plopped right, down in the middle of their old worship grounds or something, and maybe they're looking for revenge. Who knows? But back to your earlier point, about what is it McCarthy is trying to paint, and you mentioned the element of time and change, and one of the other themes that I see here is this, with Billy, trying to grow up, moving from being a naive adolescent on the verge of manhood into, learning the hard lessons of life. And again, I don't think that McCarthy ever writes this, and maybe I'm just, projecting this into my interpretation, but I would have to think that, Billy has to blame himself a little bit for, what ends up happening to his family, because it does say, I believe in the text, that it was a raid, an Indian raid that ended up killing his family.
Mm. No, yeah, definitely. It's yeah. I would say that also because it's difficult, because McCarthy is obviously not very cut and dry. You read the text and probably take a note out of my friend Athenian Stranger's book, that you're never reading, you're always rereading, right? There's whenever you read a McCarthy book, right? The idea that no good deed goes unpunished is sort of this overlapping. Yeah, it's the overlapping theme of all of his work, right? Whether it's Billy here, and then actually you could even say Billy with the Wolf, or Boyd's later adventure into Mexico, right? There's always something done with intentions that are maybe not noble, but at least somewhat good, right? That
Right.
end up getting that you end up kind of regretting, right? The Road plays with this, and I'm going to keep mentioning other McCarthy works because he does so seamlessly kind of weave these themes into all of his work.
Yes, it's impossible, not to reference other McCarthy work, because it does seem to overlap with each other. But TR, before we get on to the Mother Wolf, there was another question that in my notes that I wrote down that I would like your opinion upon it. Do you believe that Billy is truly an autonomous actor, meaning that he's capable of making these decisions, or is he merely just from McCarthy's view, from the writer's perspective, or is McCarthy just kind of setting this character, Billy, and just kind of rolling him through, a storyline, much like a child might, take a toy race car, and roll it through the living room. Do you see Billy as being autonomous and changing the environment around him, or is he being acted upon?
That's a really interesting sort of literary, like a philosophical literary question, right? Uh, if do you know George R. R. Martin,
No.
the Game of Thrones guy?
Oh, well,
Well,
no.
he wrote the Game of Thrones book series rather, and he has this quote that's sort of been haunting me and a few other people for a while because I don't know what to do with it. He talks about how there are architects and gardeners, right? When it comes to writing, architects lay everything out, and the characters sort of serve the writer, who is the architect in this case. The characters are merely another planned out sort of tool that the writer uses to get his point across, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the gardener is putting a character in a situation, right, and watching what happens, and letting the character uh, organically uh, drive the plot rather than the writer sort of trying to force a character into a certain situation, right? It's all very meta, right?
Yeah.
It's all very, at a certain level it gets a little too high minded for me,
Mm.
because at the end of the day, you the writer, are putting words on a page as the events unfurl. Um, my so in one sense, Billy is not autonomous at all. He is just words on a piece of paper to convey a story.
Right.
Unlike the most basic, like stupid sort of materialist view, no, right? To engage with your question a little bit deeper, though, because I I really enjoy it. Actually, it's a really good question. To engage with that a little bit deeper, McCarthy, I would say, is he's playing. It's kind of like Greek tragedy, right? And the episode I did with Athenian Stranger on Ajax hasn't come out yet at the time of this recording, but will kind of tie into this really well. Most tragedy is a morality tale, right? So when you are setting out to write about the downfall of somebody, right, uh, you're you're giving them a flaw, that sort of tragic flaw. And this is, I'm oversimplifying the Greeks and sort of over complicating the moderns, if that makes sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but when the Greeks were setting out their stories, it was done in a way as to teach a lesson to the people, right? McCarthy, I think, is doing that. Uh, and what is, but the question is, what is he trying to tell us?
Yeah.
Right. I would say from my read of this and his other work that there is a sort of, he has this fatalistic streak in him, right?
Yes.
I don't think I'm telling any stories outside of school with that. That mankind, he's got, like, the Hobbesian line of that the life, a man's life is cruel, brutish, and short. I'm sure I messed that up, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
He's definitely echoing that, right? Um, so we have in Billy the sort of, I would say that he is merely acting upon what McCarthy is trying to get put across. And again, that I have a tendency, especially on this show, to say what is obvious and think it's profound. uh, and yeah, I don't really have a better way of saying that, and I hope that that sort of answers your question.
Uh, yeah. There's a lot there. I guess if I were to answer my own question, I read this a lot more like McCarthy is just moving Billy from point A to point B.
Mm.
And all of these things happen to Billy. And Billy, in a lot of ways, is kind of one or two dimensional.
Mm.
I don't see a lot of uh, him having to make any moral choices per se. He's he's naive. He's young. He's green. One of the things that leads me to believe that is that there's many times in the book where somebody will offer him a cigarette and he'll say, "No, I've never taken it up." And on one hand, that could actually be a sign of moral virtue, but also, um, in another way, men smoke because of the things that have happened to them that they
Mm.
can't deal with it, and they have to get this uh, sense of levity, escape their mind for a period of time. I remember hearing one explanation as to why these old Western cowboys would eat such spicy stuff, and it was because their taste buds had been so destroyed, off, from years of travel and so forth, that was the only way that they could taste anything, was to put something in their mouth that was uh, you know uh, so exceptionally scalding, maybe not temperature, but otherwise. And so for Billy, I've gotten off track here with answering the question. I just
Feel
I,
free. That we are a tangent friendly podcast.
I he just seems to be moving, and the world is beating him up. He's taking gut punch after gut punch, and I hate to spoil. I'll go ahead and spoil the ending, but he the final paragraph, and he goes and he sits, on this road, and he's just bawling his eyes up, eyes out. And, he's got a horse that's nearly dead, the dog that, wanted to be his friend, and he shoos him off, and then he changes his mind to try to get the dog to come back. And his brother's dead. His family's dead. He has nothing. And all of this has happened to Billy. Like, Billy didn't really choose any of this stuff to happen. Like, all of this stuff happened to him, and it's really a tender, heartbreaking moment. And so that's, looking at it from point A to point B, that's the way that I look at it.
You can say, so the fact that his name is Billy, right? It's not Bill, it's not Will, it's not William, right?
Mm-hmm.
The name itself evokes sort of childishness, right?
Right.
The loving affection from people around him who would treat him with kid gloves. Uh, I actually don't know any Billies in my life, but I imagine that I would have stopped calling them Billy at some point, unless it was sort of, unless it's something. It's a very intimate nickname, let's say,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right.
So there you're completely on the money, right? And contrasting him shooing the dog away at the end, right? Where he's this world weary soul. He's hardened. He's not soft hearted nor soft handed, right? He's just buried his brother, right? He's all alone in the world, and whereas young him goes through all sorts of trials just to return a wolf a wild, dangerous animal, right, that he has some affinity for. He'll go through a lot, right, and just to return her where he thinks that she might be from, contrasted to the end where he won't give this dog the time of day. And the reason that McCarthy is such a masterful storyteller is that he immediately has this tinge of regret, right?
Right.
Where he tries to get the dog back, right? He tries to reconnect. He tries to make another decision with his life, that no, he's not going to be this hard-hearted son of a bitch. He's not going to be what the world has tried to make him into, that he is going to foster some tenderness, even though he has every reason not to. And because he acted rashly, that choice is then taken away from him as the dog doesn't come back. Very, you were right. Complete gut punch at the end, right? Because we like to think, especially as men, we like to think that we are hardened, that we are able to withstand the tough days that are ahead. And I don't know about yourself. I definitely see tough days ahead, and I think we wouldn't be on our side of Twitter if we thought things were okay and we're going to continue to be so. But there has to be McCarthy's warning men about completely hardening yourself, right? About losing all tenderness. And although it's dangerous to be completely tender, right, as you alluded to with Billy's encounter with the Indian, if he were a little wiser, a little bit more, a little bit more worldly, right, he probably would have told his dad about the Indian. Maybe the family doesn't get massacred, you know. But at the same time, there still has to be a little bit of boyishness in each man, right? Am I hitting the target?
No, you you hit so many targets. The contrasting, we haven't even talked about the pregnant wolf, at this moment, but it's like, what is that about? Like, what is he trying to do? There. And I think that illustrates that he was trying to do the right thing. Like, it would have been really easy to have just shot the wolf and have been done with it, but it was as if that he was trying to put things back in the right order, and he didn't want to just let it go on on their side of the river, so to speak, because they had livestock, and there would be baby wolves that grow up into larger wolves, and that's a problem. And so he wanted to do the right thing. And yeah, like, this is just such a gut-wrenching story on so many levels, because he gets down there and then he gets I don't know if it was this time he gets arrested, or he basically gets into the service of some of these Mexicans down there, and then they take the wolf from him and then put it into basically this dogfighting operation. And Billy then what does he have to do? Then he's got to he ends up shooting the wolf to basically save it from this very awful game that these Mexicans have been playing. And so yeah, you just touched upon so many great things, trying to do the right thing, and then the absolute wrong outcome continually happens to Billy.
So another thing with the wolf, right? Because what you hit on there, where yes, the wolf is pregnant, and he's taking care of, if he shoots the wolf, right, he's not only taking care of the immediate problem, but he'd be taking care of a future issue as well, right? There wouldn't be another generation of wolves to attack his livestock, to ruin the family plot, and to sort of to interrupt, to rewild, I guess is a good way to put it, the garden or the homestead that they're trying to build, right? And that's another aspect of McCarthy, right, that we see in his work, right, is that man is constantly trying to create civilization.
Yeah.
Right. whether it's Western man, whether it's white man, whatever standard you want to put, that man uses violence as a civilizing force, right? McCarthy is telling us that Billy, as a young boy, does not have the stuff, right? That
Yeah.
he is by returning this wolf to, or trying to return the wolf rather, to where he thinks that she's from, because also he has no fucking idea.
Right.
Like he's just going off of a guess, right? Maybe an educated guess, but still, he's going pretty deep into Mexico just to return this wolf. And just like the Indian, right, and the raid later, the wolf is a force pushing back against frontier life, against the civilizing force of trying to create a garden out of a jungle, right? Because the jungle, and I don't know how many times I'm going to use this analogy, but it just works so well. Like a jungle is constantly trying to swallow up anything that is not jungle, right? Chaos always tries to beget chaos. It is only order that can fight back from chaos. So the ordered garden, the ordered pasture, the ordered homestead, right?
Yeah.
It must constantly, civilization must constantly be upkept and in some ways fought for, right? And we're seeing today even that the machine is very advanced, but we trade robustness for the advanced technology that we have, right?
Yeah.
So we're seeing, airplanes that are failing, right? We're seeing heck, how many Cybertrucks have failed in the last few months, right? There any delicate advanced piece of machinery, right? Any piece of civilization we can say needs constant upkeep and needs constant know-how and love and care in order to keep it running. And when you either don't have the technology or the will to keep civilization going, even it will stall out. We'll stop advancing. We have the same iPhone that we had like 3 years ago, let's say, right, with a couple of nifty AI features, but really, I mean, the technology is mostly the same, right?
Right.
Every software engineer I talk to is constantly talking about tech debt, and that's another thing we could get into. But it's clear to me that if the wheels of progress aren't already stopped, they are very rapidly slowing down and breaking down, and we see that we see that Billy's adventure is a metaphor for that.
So TR, I think you said a lot of interesting things there, but the most interesting thing that I heard was you mentioned this interplay between civilization and violence. And there is an implication that when you are in a civilized area, that violence no longer exists.
Right.
Okay. That because we're civilized, we're not going to enact violence to get our will, upon our neighbor or anybody else. But if you take that same principle out into the jungle, okay, it's not going to work. I had a brief layover, as many have, in libertarianism, and I read the books, Rothbard and Hoppe and so forth, and on paper, like all of this stuff just makes so much sense until you realize that if you wanted to set up a civilization that you knew that you could secure, then yeah, libertarianism makes a lot of sense. But the problem is you have to do non-liberal things to establish these borders around your liberal society. And so here what we have is Billy very much being a liberal, a classical liberal, to this wolf and wanting to do, the right thing, but he goes into illiberal areas. And it turns out very badly for him. And that is kind of I think a theme, one way or another, with his encounter with the Indian, with the wolf, and later with other Mexican authorities, is that there is this friction going back to the one of the themes that we outlined at the beginning. This border, this line between what is civilized and what is not.
Yes.
It's that is where I think McCarthy is dancing on both sides of the line to illustrate the problems that exist if you are not, when you dance outside of the lines, you're going to get pretty bruised and so forth. You're going to end up like Billy at the end. And there's something to be said too about a man that never crosses over the boundary to get bruised, right? If you've got a man that never leaves home, okay, and he never goes off to college, and just he doesn't he never gets in a fight. He's a man with soft hands. He's not even a man.
Right. The knight in shining armor hasn't had his metal tested. It's very much this. In order to protect what is yours, you have to range out and become dangerous, right? So yes, they have to leave the homestead in order to be tested, right? In order to keep themselves sharp for any dangers that come in the future. And the reason that the family unfortunately perishes is because Billy and Boyd and to some extent the father aren't up to snuff, right? There's a really good book on the Comanche, Empire of the Summer Moon. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
It's by S.C. Gwynn. It's an ethnographic history of the Comanche people, especially like one of the last Comanche chiefs, Quanah Parker. It does a very good job of, because one of the things that I detest about sort of modern histories, especially of native tribes, is the bury my heart at Wounded Knee historiography, right? Where it's just complete. It's all genocide. It's white man just completely decimated these people. The Comanche were a warrior people, and they were defeated while they still got their licks in. The reason that Quanah Parker is named that is because his mother, Dorothy Parker, was actually kidnapped by Quanah's father as a child, and then turned into one of his brides. Right. So there's a, there's a lot to be said, and I've talked about this before, where what the government did in, whether it's tearing up treaties or renegotiating where certain borders are, obviously that's wrong, but you can also not paint the conflict as this sort of moral black and white, where these poor noble savages were completely massacred by a uniquely evil threat from the east.
That's right. I agree with you. You mentioned the phrase "the noble savage," and it's really a subversive message that is pushed through media, entertainment, and education, which always does prop up Western white men as being uniquely evil, and also it paints the Indian as being completely at peace with nature, with each other. And really what you're saying here is that civilization is bad. Okay, that is the implication of that particular mindset, which is electricity, running water, all of these things that that make life easier. What you're saying is that no, technology is bad, and what we need to revert to is the total evaporation and just live, amongst the trees and eat berries and grass all day long, or something like that. But of course, we know any honest telling of history will show that the natives were just as savage as any other group of people out there. They were not homogenous. They were a very diverse crew of natives. There were some even in Central and South America that had their own civilizations themselves. And what we see consistently around the world is that humans, when they interact with one another, they always will need sacrifice to relieve themselves of guilt and beings that were Christian sin. Okay. And if you don't have, and what I would say the ultimate truth in Christ to alleviate this guilt, you're going to end up sacrificing your own, whether that's adults or even children. But I know I'm going pretty far afield here, but I think that it's just worth pointing out the subversive nature of trying to paint this good versus evil of white versus the the native the natives that were already here. Now there's still plenty to learn from the mistakes that the white man did make. I mean, there are lessons there, but you've got to be careful not to just say, well, the white man bad and evil, and we've got to turn Western civilization on its head.
And you can even say that Billy falls prey to this idea at the beginning when he does take this journey into Mexico, by trying to return this wolf to nature, only for it and its consequences to terrorize him for the rest of his life.
Right.
Because he's kind of weak-willed, because he's soft-handed and soft-hearted, he is. And it's actually really interesting, because then he becomes so hard that he can't even love civilization, right? In the guise of a domesticated dog, right? So he's so in love with nature, he's so in love with the other in a lot of ways, that he will fight for it, right? He will try to bring things to balance, even though he doesn't understand that by his family's homestead being on the border, right, a garden in the jungle, he has already messed up the balance.
Right. So there's this really good encounter that Billy has early in the book in his travels, and he meets the old man that's sick in the back room,
mm-hmm.
and it's. I'll paraphrase here, and he questions Billy. He says, "You want to catch this wolf, maybe for the skin or the money, or buy some boots, but where is the wolf? The wolf is like the copo de nieve." Sorry, my Spanish is terrible, but basically that's a snowflake. He says, you catch the snowflake, but when you look at it in your hand, you don't have it anymore. Maybe you see this beacon, but before you can see it, it is gone. If you want to see it, you have to see it on its own ground. If you catch it, you lose it.
Mm.
And where it goes, there is no coming back from. Not even God can bring it back. And so this ties exactly with what you're talking about, this idea of nature. And I'm fascinated with this idea, because we whoever we is, Westerners or people or humans, we love to see nature. I'll take my kids to the aquarium, or to some outdoor exhibits, And it's like we're looking at a picture of nature, but that's actually not nature because it's not it, we've caught the snowflake, and now the snowflake is no longer that. It's merely just like a figment or a fragment of what it was. And
Right.
so and again, what is being shown here is that when humans come into contact with nature, we there's an interplay there that destroys nature all around us. And again, I don't think that's we shouldn't frame that as being good or bad, in a moral sense. Like that's just how we operate. But again, I think that there are subversive, and the left is great at because we know this in the back of our mind. We know that when we chop down trees and build our house, that we are disturbing nature. And the leftist environmentalists use that as propaganda. Now they're not real environmentalists. Okay, I would say it's people on our side of things that actually know how to conserve the environment, not just use it up, um, for just the sake of using it up. But all of these things, I just see so many patterns of how it relates to the current dialogue in our time.
So you mentioned before, however briefly, that you are a man of faith, as am I, and we are called to be stewards of the land, right? So I'm not out here saying that we need to pollute or make drinking water undrinkable in pursuit of an unsustainable growth forever, right? I'm definitely not a line go up guy, right?
Yep.
But the world was given to us as a gift to maintain and to also be fruitful and multiply, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, and I mentioned this because I had Max from White Boy Summer Apparel, WBS Apparel, to discuss Blood Meridian the other week. So I think that's 2 episodes ago, so that'd be episode 30, which everyone should check out as well. So two McCarthys in the same month,
Nice.
which is great. But I mentioned there that post fall man, in order to do kind of what God can do, which is create a garden, right? Because God creates man, He creates the garden for man to live in. Man sins and is kicked out of the garden, put into the wilderness, right? Man's job then, right? Because Adam is tasked with work, he is tasked with toil. He has to create the garden,
Mm-hmm.
right? He has to create civilization. He has to create a place for him to exist, right? So our sin has led to our toil, right? And part of that, what McCarthy especially talks about in The Crossing, in Blood Meridian, is that our attempts to create a garden are blood soaked. That in order to because we are fallen, because we are sinful creatures, in order to get close to what God can do naturally through goodness, we must achieve through evil.
Mm.
If that, and I'm not, I, I'm talking in a very metaphysical sort of
Yep.
higher level.
Yep.
It's clear to anybody listening that we have a sin nature, right? I'm not saying that every action, like I'm and that's the thing too, is that leftist subversion, right, can take this and twist it to mean that every action that Western man has done is evil, and it's just the reason that it's so pernicious is because it is accurate but not truthful,
Yeah.
right? So yes, it is true that Western man has done evil things, right? But that is kind of beside the point.
What man hasn't?
Exactly, and
I,
and
I,
it's almost just as evil to not create civilization, right?
yeah.
You are denying yourself, your progeny, and future generations any sort of staying power if you do not have home and hearth.
Hmm. That's really good. I haven't heard it put that way, but that's good. So to respond to this idea of the fall of man and the garden, I think can be summed up really simple with the Thomas Sowell quote, which is there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. Okay. And I think that the left is utopianist. They want to say that there is a solution for everything, and whatever problem there is, if we just take this all-encompassing solution right now, then we can fix and expel, all of the evil that is there. But that's, of course, that's not how life works. There's always the unintended consequence. There's always going to be, the things in the margins that are left over. A little bit about my background. I grew up in East Central Illinois on a farm. My family, I think my family's a fifth generation farmer. I've got to do the counting, but I guess I have to got two younger brothers that still farm. I moved to Georgia to pursue this basketball thing. Not sure why, but that's for another time. But my family, my grandfather in particular, his father fought in World War I. So that would have been my great grandfather. And he contracted the Spanish flu, came home, and died a few years later from complications of the Spanish flu. So my grandfather, on my father's side, was raised basically by his uncle, and once he got out of high school, was gifted 40 acres of land, and he built that up over a period of time into a 2,000-acre corn and soybean farm, in which my father and my two brothers have taken over. And so the point of all of this is that my family has always been, the word that we use is conservation. They've been conservation minded. Okay. Not environmentalist. And one of the early things that I remember my father and grandfather doing was no-till farming, meaning they wouldn't take a big plow, into the ground and turn the dirt over. Why? Because that leads to soil erosion. But instead, they would just let the soil be, and then plant the next year's crop directly into it, which would create a level of that good carbon on top of the soil. And I find it interesting that the lefty environmentalists always like to talk about carbon free or carbon net neutral. Like, you talk to my father and he's like, carbon is good, and the more that we've got automobiles, speeding around interstates and so forth, like, that's carbon dioxide, which, the plants, just immediately suck up and convert into oxygen. But that's another thing. But to bring it back home here, the point is that if you are tied to the land, if you are living historically, and you have this piece of land which you own, you want to take care of that the best that you can. You're not just raping the land and to get a quick profit. In libertarian terms, it's you want to be very low time preference. You want to make sure that land will sustain you for a period of time. And so going back to this idea of trade-offs, and it's never going to be perfect, but you do want to preserve and conserve for the future.
Well, and it's interesting that you mention especially libertarianism, right? I think it was John Locke that talked about the tragedy of the commons,
Yeah.
right? So, and for a basic civics lesson, right? The tragedy of the commons is that if nobody owns a piece of real estate, let's say, it will be worked to death until
Yes.
it is completely barren, because everyone is trying to get theirs, basically trying to extract value from something that they are getting for free, right? So you can say that people who, and I mean, we kind of see this even with another sort of stain on the American West, which is the almost decimation of the bison.
Yeah.
Right. The American bison almost goes away at the end of the 19th century, because they're a wild plains driven animal that either are just hunted for their meat and their pelts to death, right? Or some of them, some herds are even hunted to death to kill off the Indians who sustain themselves on them, right? So the American bison, because they weren't owned by anybody, right? Because no government claimed them, because no person claimed a herd, let's say, for themselves, except for, of course, the Indians who claim them, not in the same way that whites claim land, right? Because and that's another misnomer. It's like, yes, there's clearly ownership. Tribes clearly have ownership, but not in the way that the European settlers do, and that sort of, that again has been twisted by history to mean no ownership at all. I could go hours on this, and I'm sure it would get pretty spicy and people would laugh and I would lose my livelihood. But anyway, so we almost lose one of God's creatures because nobody was there to stop it from happening.
Right.
You know what I mean? And at the same time, like I'm screw the pandas. If they die out because they don't want to breed, well, that's kind of on them, and some can you can extrapolate that as far out as you want to whatever species, but there is a responsibility that a landowner has for whatever it is that occurs on his land, right? If voles or groundhogs take over, right, and or even rabbits, right? We think of rabbits as these cute, fluffy, innocent animals, right? But if you're growing vegetables, rabbits suck. Not only are they eating your crop, but they are leaving excrement everywhere. They're insert externality here. There as you said, which I think you were quoting Thomas Sowell. There are no solutions, only trade-offs, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you bring up the bison or the buffalo. I'm actually reading a book, kind of casually, The American Buffalo. It's
love that book. Terrific.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great book.
Yeah, and he references how it was the putting down the rail lines, the railroad. Yeah, that was a problem, because so there was incentive for, you could say, the government or the big capitalists, to, hey, we've got to get these buffalo out of here because it's, they're getting in the way, and, rails are hitting them. It's really just a tragic, it's a tragic situation all the way around, because then, when you have this increased commercial demand for, the fur and the meat and so forth, well, then the Indians kind of get in on the fun where they're, running, the herds off of, off of the cliffs, and
right.
The stories about how they were able to do that with, the optical illusion is just fascinating to me. That's really really good. But anyhow, we're
a little far afield.
We're far afield here
of the book, but also
yeah.
not, because these are all topics that McCarthy covers. Maybe less so the bison, just because of where in the country we are, but that idea of conquering nature, definitely.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we cover all of your notes because we are uh, over an hour now. We usually try to go for hour and a half. But Mr. Hemingway, what else you got for me?
Well, I definitely want to talk about this meeting that that Billy has with this fella that's in a rundown kind of. I don't know if he's a priest or an ex-priest, but McCarthy goes on, writing, for about 20 pages, and I've got to say here that there's nothing more annoying. Maybe this is what all a podcast is, so maybe this is annoying, but I'm not sure. But when when you talk to somebody, you have a conversation, and that person begins to tell you another conversation that they've had with somebody else.
I see.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to pull off well.
Right.
And I understand, and it is annoying in that it's pretty convoluted, but when it's done well, you almost don't notice it.
Yes, and that's exactly what McCarthy does here, is because Billy encounters this man who begins to tell him a story, and he's got all these cats around, and he says, how many eggs do you want? I'll take 4, and he gives them coffee, and there's this line, I'm not sure if you caught it or not, but Billy at one point looks down into his coffee mug, and McCarthy says he looks down and at the bottom of his coffee, and it was not coffee. Did you catch that? And I wonder if, is he implying that this was a kind of a psychedelic experience that he was having? Did this guy drug him? So to speak. I'm not sure. I don't see any evidence directly, but I found that one line to be kind of odd.
Well, so there are magical elements in the book, right? And it's very it's understated, which is McCarthy's whole thing, right? There's the story of he wrote Blood Meridian, and then it took him 10 years to just strip it to its barest bones, right? And that's what we got. We got the barest, most concentrated story out of it, right? So he never spells anything out that's obvious for you as the reader. You have to do a lot of work when you read McCarthy as a reader. And I could believe that he has been given some sort, like maybe peyote, right?
Yeah.
What this interaction also kind of had for me, because it could just be liquor,
Sure.
There's a book by Graham Greene called The Power and the Glory. Are you familiar?
I'm not.
It's a terrific novel. One of my new favorites because I only just recently read it. It's about there's a period in the 1920s, I believe, where the Mexican government outlawed Catholicism. Right. So all the priests in a certain region of Mexico had to either renounce their faith, be in exile, or die. Right. So this is the last priest in the region. His story. He's a terrible Catholic. Right. He's given up on his vows because his vow of chastity. He has a blood relation daughter, right, who he visits from time to time. He's a drunk, but he still has reverence for his collar and for his purpose. So he still gives mass. He still hears confession. He still gives the Eucharist. So really good book. I have a friend, I think, who wants to cover it. So I highly recommend it. But that's what I immediately thought of when I read that scene.
Yeah. So the other thing that I would like to kind of expound upon from this, which is, I think that I've read McCarthy say something similar, and perhaps I've even heard Spangler, or I've read Spangler say, something similar, which is there is no individual story. It's all, every story is contained within the one story.
Right.
And
Joseph Campbell, right?
okay,
Maybe.
yeah. So what I find interesting about this is because this priest is telling Billy this story about this man who has his family killed, and then he goes out and he has to do these things, and then he ends up meeting this priest, and they have this argument about the nature of God and so forth. And I find it interesting that it's almost there's like some foreshadowing that is here. I mean, it's not one to one, but nothing is ever one.
Right. It's like he's having the conversation that Billy should be having with the priest.
Right.
It's a very strange frame device, but it's meant to evoke. McCarthy is clearly telling us that the man in the story is supposed to be Billy, and that he is supposed to be the priest.
Right.
But what's interesting about McCarthy is, of course, nothing's ever straightforward, so he has to give degrees of separation.
Exactly. And there's a great line in there about he references, this is a man with no roots and no limbs. He's a trunk, no past and no future. And that is just so powerful, because you were mentioning, about how, like, civilization, like the best thing that you can do is to provide a home, for your children. And the roots, backwards, into your history. I just told a very brief story about my family, and I have children, and so forth, and this is how things are supposed to be, encompassed within a civilization, if you will. But this man has had all of these things happen to him. His roots are cut off, his limbs are cut off, and he's nothing. He is merely just an object of he's maybe not, perhaps he's not the predicate of violence, but he is the thing acting out violence, perhaps. But it's interesting that Billy will become this man, with no roots and no limbs, no past and no future.
Oh, most definitely. And you see that because he has no roots, he therefore does not have limbs.
Yes.
Right. So at the end, right, when he shoos away the dog, right, that's him sort of chopping off his own limbs, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you can be nice to a dog, you can be nice to a kid. You know what I mean? Like, you can, that tenderness that we discussed earlier is erased in Billy from that moment out, so that a family is just not something in his future.
Right. There's another great line here. Forgive me for reading some, but he says, it's easy to see that not save sorrow could bring a man to such a view of things, and yet a sorrow for which there can be no help is no sorrow. It is some dark sister traveling in sorrow's clothing, which I've never thought about it, in that way. If something so great has happened to you, then nothing can be done to help you. It's no longer sorrow. There is no longer even sadness. It is, some, like it says, something much more sinister.
And of course, when you read Cities on the Plain, right, you see that has come to fruition, that Billy has, because Billy and John Grady, from the first book, are the main characters of Cities on the Plain to close out the trilogy. And we see that Billy has not laid down, he cannot lay down roots, and that he is in love with the openness of frontier life.
Yeah.
Well, I know you haven't read the book yet, and I just wanted to briefly mention that. and maybe as a teaser for you to continue to read it, because it is a beautiful collection of novels.
Yeah, I've got a premonition of what's going to happen with these two guys, with with no past and no future, linking up with one another. Yeah, the other thing that I found curious about this book, maybe McCarthy did this on purpose, or maybe he didn't, but every time that Billy crosses the boundary and then returns, the world has changed, and quite significantly.
Mm-hmm.
The first crossing, his family had been killed. The second time he comes back, in World War II, I believe, had broke out.
Mm-hmm.
And he tries to enlist, and he can't. He's got a health issue, can't get in. And then, of course, the final time he comes back, and his brother's dead. He's got to bury his brother. And so I know that we probably have exhausted the point here, but this idea of boundary and crossing, there's something metaphysical that that McCarthy's playing on here.
You could almost you could compare it to Dante, right, where he continually travels into hell. Though I don't want to go too deep into that metaphor, because the deeper I think about it, the quicker it falls apart.
Yeah.
But on the surface, you can say that he is living on the border between heaven and hell in some respects.
Yeah.
Right. So, Mr. Hemingway, and before I let you go, I do have to ask: are you any relation to the great Ernest Hemingway?
Oh,
you say Illinois.
I was about to compliment you. I'm like, you are the first person that I've met, that would have obvious, reasons to act. I wish that I had $1 for every time that I was asked that, but no,
it's able to buy a new farm.
I could. No, I've actually prepared. I've been preparing my whole life for this one particular question. Just kidding. From what we can tell, we've done, a good deal of research into the family tree. Ernest's family were founding stock members that came across. I believe his people landed in Connecticut, I believe, and then eventually made their way over to Illinois. They might have had a layover in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure about that, but they settled in a suburb of Chicago, Oak Park. Now, what's interesting is that my descendants came over right around the time of the Civil War and settled in that very same part, Oak Park, Illinois. And our names are spelled just alike, with one M. There's some spellings of Hemingway with 2 M's, or other derivations, but it is the same spelling. And given the fact that our family came and lived in the vicinity, you would have to assume that in those times, you're trying to link up with relatives, distant relatives, and so forth. From there, my family moved 3 hours, 3 hours now in a vehicle. It'd probably be 150, 180 miles south of Chicago to, like I said, East Central Illinois. And the other thing that I like to tell people is that, our names are spelled the same, but I didn't inherit the alcoholism, and I don't have a penchant for suicide. So, but
or gender confusion, one hopes.
That's right. I'm about midway through life, so we'll see what the second half has in store for us. I would hope that maybe I can write a couple of things, but I don't think that I'll ever get to anything close to For Whom the Bell Tolls, or Old Man in the Sea, or anything like that. I find it fun to have the last name and such.
You definitely don't need a pen name these days. Just, but I had to ask, and I almost resisted asking, but I know that my own curiosity would have eventually gotten the better of me.
Well, sure, and also the Double Dealer, from what what I understand, what you guys have told me, Ernest was one of the founding members of.
So not a founding member, but
Okay, he did
the
contribute.
the magazine did publish some very early Hemingway works. Yes, yes. The history of the Double Dealer is rife with American authors, men of letters, such as Hemingway, Faulkner, Sherwood Anderson, and many others. You are completely correct there. Yes.
Yeah, I hope one of these days to have something as quality enough to be accepted to the Double Dealer. That is one of my goals. I've got to get better at writing, but right now I'm just reading as much as I can, and one of these days I'll get there. You've given me some good pointers, before we went live, some things to read and so forth. So I'll definitely be honing my craft. I do have a Substack where I read, I write on some of my experiences as a parent. I would encourage no one to subscribe to that, because it's kind of embarrassing, because I don't really know how to write yet. So I'll let you guys know when it's time to start paying attention to me.
Well, I'll make sure to. We'll leave the links barren for now in the show notes, and
Okay.
once you have something that you're comfortable with me putting out there, I'll make sure to fill that in. So, Mr. Hemingway, is there anything else that you'd like the good people to know before we head on out?
I would just like to say that if you are not currently supporting the Double Dealer by uh, giving your good hard-earned dollars to them monthly, to the Double Dealer podcast, if you're not buying the Double Dealer volumes as they come out every so often, what are you doing at this point? You need to be supporting these good people. We Part of what we have to do in our corner of the world is to replicate culture, and we have a thick culture, I would say, wherever it is that we stand, whatever label that you would like to give to us. But Americans like us that have been raised with family members and so forth, we have a unique experience, and we need to take pride in those things, and we need to share our stories with everyone. So thanks again, Mr. Hudson, for having me on.
And I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you for agreeing to come on. Thank you for picking a terrific novel. Uh, you have done a better job than I could of explaining why the Double Dealer is important and why people should support it. So I'll just go ahead and say insert ending here.